Okay, so today we're doing May-June 2020 question paper 12. There's a good few questions in this paper which are no longer part of the syllabus. Question 2, 20, 21 and 29. So we'll start at question 30. Some really difficult questions on this paper. Starting with the first one, which is probably an unusual style of question. So during the Great Depression, the US government believed that deflation was caused by a collapse in the price of stocks and other assets, reducing the levels of confidence in the economy. So this is the key thing. Diagram shows two approaches to counter deflation. Now, the first thing we should know is that we're never going to use diagram Z to counter deflation, because we don't want to create cost push inflation, as we don't want real GDP decreasing, because that will increase unemployment, reduce national income, and decrease living standards potentially as well. We might use diagram Y. That would be the more conventional approach. So straight away we can get diagram Z out of the equation. And the two options we're left with are an expansionary monetary policy to decrease the interest rates, and expansionary fiscal policy to reduce corporation tax. So what we're going to use in this instance, remember that it's based on the confidence of the economy. So the policy they should have used would be to decrease the interest rates. Because if you think about reduced level of confidence, if you reduce corporation tax, they're not going to put that investment into the economy if they have low levels of optimism or high levels of pessimism. Instead, what they're going to do is they're going to essentially keep those additional profits as reserves. So if we decrease the interest rates, that is more likely to stimulate optimism in the economy, because it will come as a direction from the central bank. Now, if you want to think about it in real terms, even think about it in terms of what's happening in the economy now. So this is being recorded on the 25th of January. And one of the main things that's being talked about in economic circles at the moment is about the US economy, and in particularly the drive to almost near all-time high levels in the S&P 500. So what economists are currently talking about is the Fed, or the Federal Reserve in America, how recently released CPI figures were below what was expected. So there's now generating optimism in the economy about the Federal Reserve's capability to decrease the interest rates over the next couple of months. Some economists are now talking about 2 potential interest rate cuts coming in 2025, and that is therefore going to stimulate optimism. So decreasing interest rates will provide an incentive for people to invest and to increase their consumption. Whereas if we reduce corporation tax and we're just providing more money to them in forms of additional profits, the incentive or the determining factor of optimism is unlikely to be as improved as if we decrease the interest rates. And that's why when we're talking about 2025, the Federal Reserve and the interest rate cuts that happen will be more likely to stimulate economic growth than it would be if they were just to reduce direct taxation rates. So something to keep in mind for the future: if we're talking about optimism or pessimism, decreasing interest rates is more likely than just, essentially it's better than just giving people more money, because they'll just essentially save that extra more money. We want to incentivize them to try and see the potential for the economy to grow, and therefore to increase their borrowing levels. Okay, question 28. Which combination correctly classifies an expansionary fiscal measure and its impact on a budget deficit? Okay, so first of all, remember, expansionary fiscal is taxes down and government spending up. We're going to be, when we use an expansionary fiscal policy, we're going to be increasing a budget deficit, which means that government revenue will come down and government expenditure will rise. Okay, so quantitative easing could be classified no longer on the syllabus, but it's a monetary policy measure anyway. Interest rates is a monetary policy measure as well, so will not affect budget deficits, only fiscal measures will. Increase welfare spending, yes, would increase a budget deficit because it would increase government expenditure, as we can see here. Lower income tax would also increase a budget deficit. It would not reduce a budget deficit. Remember, reducing a budget deficit means that we would have government revenue rising and government expenditure dropping. So that would be, for example, if we increase income tax. Okay, question 27 is a question I've seen come up on a few different papers before. Exact same question. Economy with an interest rate of 4% per annum has a fall in the rate of inflation from 5 to 3%. Who will benefit from this fall? Menu costs will fall to zero is incorrect. As long as there is inflation, menu costs will arise. The cost of changing prices and menus for restaurants, for example. Even if the rate of inflation drops, as long as that rate of inflation is positive, menu costs will be present in the economy. People on fixed incomes will be better off in real terms is not true. People on fixed incomes will now be losing 3% in real income as opposed to 5% from the previous period in real income. Savers will gain in real terms. That is true because savers will be able to obtain a 4% increase on their savings through the interest rates, whereas the value of money will now only be decreasing by 3%, which is the new rate of inflation. And purchasing power of the currency will rise is false. Anytime we have inflation, even if the rate is dropping, again, as long as it is a positive figure, then the purchasing power of the currency will drop, it will not rise. Question 26. The statement that follow relates to possible gains from an increase in free trade. Which gain is least certain to result in the short run? Okay, so in the short run, we could have a reduction in the cost of production. We could have a wider choice of goods available to consumers and an increase in the level of competition. But the one that is likely to take place, well, could take place in the short run, but is unlikely, is a rise in the number of jobs. And why is that? Because that will depend on, for example, how much are being sold. So if we have free trade, we will have a wider choice of goods available because there's no restrictions on tariffs. We will have an increase in the level of competition, again, because there's no protectionism measures in place, so we can import or export to anywhere. We can reduce the cost of production because of this. There'll be no protectionism measures like tariffs or quotas in place, etc. So our cost of productions should be lower than before we had free trade. But in terms of our exports, even though we have more competition for exporting to other countries, we have to actually be able to export more before we can increase our output and before we can take on more employment. And that will take a time period. There'll be a bit of a time lag between the increase in demand for our exports, for example, and then the recognition and realization that we have to increase the number of people employed to generate more output that can be sold. Why does the value of a country's terms of trade have no monetary units? Very simple. Definition question. Because it's the ratio of two index numbers. It is the ratio of the index of export prices divided by the index of import prices. No monetary measures are in place. It is simply the average price of exports divided by the average price of imports. So essentially, if you know the definition, you should be able to answer that question easily. Okay, 24. Diagram shows an economy at full employment equilibrium. What short-run measures should the government take to maintain the economy's current equilibrium if there is an unexpected balance of trade surplus? Okay, so first thing is BOP surplus remember that means that our exports, in simplified terms, it means that our exports will be greater than our imports. So what that should do is it should move our aggregate demand curve to the right. Okay, because remember, net exports, X minus M, is a component of aggregate demand. So we want to maintain current equilibrium. So in other words, what we need to do is we need to find a policy measure that can shift our aggregate demand curve back to the left so that we can remain at our equilibrium and we can counteract the result of what would happen with the surplus. Okay, so higher government spending on education financed by an equal rise in direct taxation. So that is unlikely to affect it. We would have higher government spending on education financed by an equal rise in direct taxation. So we would have no change in our AD here, and we would remain at AD1 because those two would be counterbalanced. High direct taxation, so which is a contractionary fiscal policy, AD left, with government spending unchanged to create a budget surplus. Okay, so that would. So in that case, we would have only AD moving to the left. Government spending is unchanged. Higher direct taxation is a contractionary fiscal policy. AD would move back to the left and we would return into equilibrium here. Higher government spending on infrastructure financed by a budget deficit. That would be an expansionary fiscal policy, increase in government spending. AD would move further to the right and we'd move further away from our equilibrium. And lower interest rates to promote investment spending. That would be an expansionary monetary policy. Again, it would be designed to increase consumption and investment. AD would move right and we would move further away from what we had previously, or further away from the equilibrium we're trying to achieve. Okay, 23. According to US Consumer Price Index statistics, an identical good that costs $100 in 1913 would now cost $2,359.60 in 2013, 100 years later. What is the approximate cumulative rate of inflation? Okay, very simple. If you divide 2,300 into 100, you're going to get 230. Okay? Now remember that 1 here, 1 represents 100%. Right? So therefore, 230 will represent 2,300%, which is the cumulative rate of inflation. (22) Which argument is an importer most likely to use to gain the support of customers for free trade? The importer. So more imports allow the government to raise revenue from tariffs, so that's not going to help the consumers for free trade. And secondly, tariffs is not going to be a part of free trade, so that can't be the correct answer. More imports improve the country's terms of trade. Well, that is just plainly false. So if they make that argument, you would hope that the consumers would be smart enough to recognize it's incorrect. More imports increase competition in the domestic industry. That would be an argument they would make, because what that would do is that should make lower prices for the consumers. So if the importer is making this argument, they're saying that if you allow us to have free trade, it should make your domestic firms more efficient or incentivize them to become more efficient, and therefore create more competition for them and result in lower prices for you as the consumer. And more imports raise total employment. That's false. More exports can raise total employment in the domestic economy. More imports can raise living standards, but doesn't necessarily raise the total level of employment. The employment is generated from the importing economy, from the economy that is exporting and not from the domestic economy that is importing. Okay, question 19. What is likely to cause a decrease in AD? So we're going to be looking for either contractionary fiscal policy or contractionary monetary policy here. Remember, monetary policy, increase in money supply is expansionary monetary policy, designed to move AD to the right and therefore to increase AD. Increase in government expenditure is expansionary fiscal policy, designed to increase AD and move AD to the right. Improvement in consumer confidence will definitely not decrease AD. It will result in higher consumption, which is our component of AD, and therefore that may result in AD moving to the right again. But if we have an appreciation of the exchange rate, that can result in a decrease in AD. And that is because an appreciation of the exchange rate makes the price of exports higher, so it means our total exports will drop, and it makes the price of imports lower, which makes our total imports go up. And then that will result in X minus M, which is our net exports on AD, coming down and aggregate demand shifting to the left. Okay, countries' railways are run by private firms. It has been suggested that the government should nationalise or take over control of those railways. What might be a reason for this? So there's a couple of different reasons here, but one is the main reason that would influence the argument for nationalisation. And that argument for nationalisation is that the prices of those products are too high. So there could be a monopoly developed by those private firms, and there could be, or it could be said that the government needs to nationalise that industry in order to reduce the prices of railway services for people. Remember that the government should get involved if the industry or the product that's being provided is of great national importance. And public transportation systems are definitely of great national importance because they are used by a large proportion of society. So the government's aim, remember, is to provide accessibility and affordability for its citizens, and therefore controlling prices of railway services would be an argument to nationalise the industry. Encourage competition would not happen if the government comes in and takes control. Increase the profit incentive would not happen. Private sector would no longer be involved. And to provide jobs for local people. Okay, that could be an argument for the nationalisation of the industry. However, it's unlikely to be as persuasive an argument as controlling the prices, which could be through the development of a monopoly from these private firms. Which measure would not be part of a government subsidy, okay, to protect domestic producers from competition? So interest-free loans provided by the government would be part of a subsidy. So would reducing corporation taxes, and so would transfer payments, because they're all potentially ways of providing domestic producers with more funds, essentially, right? Whereas import quotas will not be, because they do not help to protect domestic producers from competition. Well, they do, but they're not part of a subsidy. They don't help to provide them with more funds. Whereas interest-free loans will, and we know that that is the objective of a subsidy. Reducing their corporation tax will help to provide them indirectly with more funds too, as will providing transfer payments help to provide them with more funds. Whereas import quotas will just limit the number of imports that can come in, and they will not therefore directly subsidise the domestic production. Question 16. A government decides to replace a private company with its own to collect household waste. Why could such action be justified? So I'd understand if you said A here, because waste collection is a private good, because we know that's when governments get involved. However, waste collection is not a private good. It is not non-excludable and it is not rivalrous, so we can't have that as an option for this particular question. The costs of waste collection are bound to be lower if paid out of local taxes. Not necessarily true. We might have more inefficiency with the government if they're controlling or collecting the household waste themselves. So even if they're paid out of local taxes, it doesn't necessarily mean that the costs of the waste collection will be lower. Private companies are always less efficient than government companies. Okay, that's just plainly incorrect. We know that they're more efficient than government companies are. But a justification for the government collecting the household waste might be that the private companies are putting profits before consumers' needs, which is exactly or almost the exact same as question 18, right? It's that they're essentially achieving, let's say, supernormal or high levels of profits, and we need to reduce the prices that consumers are paying to help meet that objective of accessibility and affordability for all citizens in society. Question 15, we've got a market demand and supply curve. What would happen if a government imposed a maximum price of $10? Okay, first of all, remember that a maximum price here, this would, it would very simply not work. Max price has to be imposed below market equilibrium price to be effective. If it is placed above market equilibrium price, then what happens is the market just continues to trade at the current equilibrium. So therefore, government would need to supply Q1 to Q3 is wrong. Quantity sold to be Q1 is wrong. Quantity sold to be Q2, that's correct because that is current market equilibrium, and that will continue to operate here if the maximum price is ineffective and placed above current equilibrium. Okay, question 14. Privatization can be achieved by the sale of shares to the general public, which we're saying is revenues from PO, public offers, or by the direct sale to a private company, private sales PS. This shows the diagram, or shows privatization transactions and revenue for the European Union between 1981 and 2012, what can be concluded from the diagram. Okay. Any increase in the number of privatizations resulted in an increase in privatization revenue. That is not true. We can see the number of privatizations would be represented by the transactions here. So if you just take 1995 as an example, our level of transactions is nearly 200, but the revenue that we've generated is only 30,000. So there's not a direct correlation. And then even here, 2005, our transactions are actually below the revenues that we generated. So that definitely can't be concluded from the diagram. Average revenue per privatization was highest in 2000. No, the total revenue was highest in 2000. We don't know the average revenue. It's not given to us in the diagram that was shown. Main revenue from privatization changed from public offers to private sales. So at the start here we can see this dark diagram here is public offers, and most of it was coming from public offers here. And then as we move further in the diagram, so that would be correct. As we move further along the diagram, we can see that private sales, which is the lighter shade of grey, takes up a greater proportion of the total revenues that are generated. So that's true. Number of privatization and revenue raised peaked in the same year, and that is also incorrect. Again, number of privatizations would be transactions here, and then revenue is not the same or doesn't correlate with the highest revenues in the year. Okay, question 30 is it's an unusual one. I haven't seen one like this before come up too frequently on the papers, as it actually follows us to do simple mathematics instead of economics really. But what we need to understand here is we've got a tax. Change in the product makes QS equal P minus 36, and then we've got QS and QD in formulas for them both. So the first thing we need to do is we need to understand or calculate what our equilibrium price is, right? So our equilibrium price is when quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. So in that case here, that would be quantity supplied is P minus 30 will equal 240 minus 2P. Okay, basic mathematics, just solve the equation for P. So that will be 3P equals 270. Bring across your 30 here and plus to 240. And then P will therefore equal 90. So that means the price of our product is 90. Now after our change with the taxation, we've got to substitute in the new quantity supplied figure here. So that will be P minus 36 will still equal 240 minus 2P. Bring the 2P across will give us 3P equals 240. Bring this across and plus 276. And then P will equal 92. Okay, so very simple. Once we have the taxation, we can see the previous price was 90 and the new price is 92. So it will rise by $2. Okay, diagram shows the supply curve of a product. Government imposes a specific indirect tax of $5 on the product. How will the PES of the product change? So even if you didn't know how to draw the diagram with the new indirect tax, very simple, because once it comes out of the point of origin as a straight line, we should know at this stage, very common exam question, that it is a unitary PES. Okay, but now just to show you, or to extend it a little bit, because we've talked about this previously but not as much, the new supply curve will look something like this, right? Now what happens here is, say for example if I draw another diagram out here and call this S2, we're going to show why it becomes more elastic. So just like the linear demand curve, if I pick a price here and I come across, and let's say I come down here and I pick the same price and come across to S2, the quantity here is going to be a bigger number, right, in S2, and the quantity is going to be a smaller number here in S1. So when we have a supply curve that starts along the vertical axis, because let's say it has an indirect tax imposed, then what's going to happen is, because the quantity is smaller, any change in price here will represent a greater percentage change in the quantity supplied, right? Whereas if we change the price here and we come across to S2, we can see the quantity supplied will only change by a much smaller percentage. It will change by this as a percentage of the total over here, whereas in S1 it will change by this as a percentage of the total going to the left until we get to 0. So we can say that would nearly be a 50% change in S1, and it might only be a 5% change in S2. So it's to do with the starting quantity level, and that is why if we impose the $5 tax, the supply curve will shift to the left. It will start on the vertical axis, and the quantity supplied will be starting from a smaller number, which means that the percentage change would be bigger. Whereas S2, it'll be starting with a larger number, so the percentage change from any resulting change in price will be a smaller percentage. Okay, question 11. Straightforward functions of price mechanism. Signaling, rationing, incentivizing. Doesn't provide incentives for government. Remove shortages by creating incentives for prices to fall. Remember, shortages, it creates incentives for prices to rise. Surplus by creating incentives for market prices to rise. Again, that's incorrect. A surplus, it creates an incentive for prices to fall because there's excess supply. So the correct answer would be signaling changes in market conditions to producers and consumers. Question 10. Good has a PES of 2.0. Current quantity supplied is 300 units per week at a market price of $20 per unit. Firm raises the price to $25 per unit. What will be the new quantity supplied? Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to calculate the percentage change in price, which would be 5 over 20, which is 25% change in price. Okay, now our formula for PES is the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. So we know that is essentially x over 25% will equal 2.0, which tells us that the change or the percentage change in QS has to be equal to 50%. And if we take 50% of 300, that will give us 150 plus 300 gives us 450 units. Okay, question 9. An economy is suffering from a housing shortage. The demand for housing continues to rise as real incomes increase. So what's that going to do? That is going to move the demand for housing to the right. And as more construction firms enter the market, supply level will increase, supply will move to the right. What diagram best illustrates the situation? So simply, we're looking for a diagram where demand shifts right and where supply shifts right based on the information they've given us. So that would clearly be A, because we can see in C it's only demand changes. In D, supply level actually shifts to the left and so does demand. But for A, supply shifts to the right and demand shifts to the right, which shows us the effect of real incomes increasing and the effect of an increasing level of firms entering into the market, which will increase the supply level. Okay, question 8. Following the introduction of a 10% increase in charges for car parking, demand for bus journeys per day rose from 800 to 1,000. We're asked to calculate cross-elasticity or XED. Okay, so again, if you know the formula, this should be very straightforward. It's the percentage change in quantity demanded of good A divided by the percentage change in price of good B. So in this case, the change in quantity demanded of good A, it's gone up by 200. So it is 200 divided by 800, which will give us 25%. That's quantity demanded. And the change in price, we're told that it's a 10% increase. Okay, so input it into our formula. 25% divided by 10% will give us a cross elasticity of demand of plus 2.5, which also tells us that the two of them are substitutes for each other, because anytime the figure is plus, they're substitutes, and anytime the figure are negative here, they're complements. Okay, question 7. We've got a consumer surplus question. How does consumer surplus change as the price of the product rises? Okay, so what we'll do is we'll show you the consumer surplus here when, let's say, the price of the product is $5. So in this case, the consumer surplus will be the area above equilibrium price to the top of the demand curve. So the total area for the consumer surplus here when the price is $5 would be this area. Okay, now as the price of the product changes, we're now moving to an equilibrium price of $10. So essentially what we're doing is we're losing this area that I'm going to shade in green as the consumer surplus. Okay. Now what we can see happen is as we change our equilibrium every time, so we move up to be another $5, the area that we're losing essentially a different box every time, right? Or one box less. So now in this case, when it goes to $15, we're now losing this area shaded in black. And we can see that every time we'll increase the price of the product, we will start to lose less with every $5 rise. And that's because the further we get up with the price, there's less consumers that are willing to pay that price. So the total area for the consumer surplus will decrease. Therefore, we can see that it will fall by a decreasing amount with every $5 rise. As we can see, the green area we lost in the first rise would be much larger than the black area we lost with the second rise in price. And that will be the same as we move up to a new equilibrium price of $20 if we have another $5 price rise. Okay, question 6. A manufacturer progressively reduces the price of his product. Table shows the outcome of this policy. Okay, straightforward. We could see that his total revenue has remained unchanged. That will tell us that it has to be a unitary PED. Okay, as the price changes. And that is just basic PED information. Remember that when it's unitary, price up, total revenue the same. Price down, total revenue the same. Total revenue will never change. When it is elastic, price goes down. Quantity demanded changes by a greater percentage than price, so total revenue will rise. Price goes up, quantity demanded will fall by a greater percentage than price, so total revenue will drop. And when it is inelastic, quantity demanded will change by less than price, so it will be price up, total revenue up, price down, total revenue down. Okay, question 5. D is the demand curve for an agriculture commodity and S1 is the initial supply curve. A good harvest causes the supply to shift to S2. By how much will the demand curve have to shift to leave farm incomes unchanged? Okay, it looks complicated, but it's really not. So first of all, calculate the farm incomes, which you can see here would be price, $5, multiplied by the quantity of 2,000. Okay, so farm incomes before the change, 5 multiplied by 2k, which would give us an income of $10,000. Okay, now we need to see how much the demand curve will shift by. We can see here, for example, that at a price of $2, we would have quantity of 4,000. Okay, so in order to get back into 10k, we're going to want a price of $2 to represent a quantity that's being traded of 5,000 tons, because 2,000 multiplied by 5,000 would give us, again, the incomes back to $10,000, which would remain unchanged. So if it's currently 4,000, we need it to be 5,000. We can see that we would have to have the demand curve to shift by 1,000 tons at every price, and then that would give us back to $2 per product multiplied by 5,000, which is being sold, as opposed to the current 4,000 that we would sell in here, and then that would give us, again, incomes remaining unchanged with remaining at $10,000 for the farmers. Okay, normative statements, opinion, subjective, value-based statements. So minimum wage is the correct government policy to increase the incomes of the lowest paid workers. That is a normative statement. It is subjective. It is opinion based. A minimum wage is the lowest amount employers can legally pay their workers. That is a positive statement. It is objective, it is factual, and it can be tested. The same with C. A minimum wage of 15,000 Pakistani rupees per month was set on the 1st of June 2016. It's a factual hypothesis that we can test. Same with D. Setting the minimum wage rate above the equilibrium will result in an excess supply of workers. Factual, testable statement. Okay, question 3. A factory introduces an automated production line to take advantage of division of labour. What is most likely to increase? That would be worker productivity. Average cost of production is likely to come down because as we achieve economies of scale. Job satisfaction of workers is also likely to come down. The main disadvantage of the division of labour is the boredom that it creates for the workers. The range of skills of each worker is likely to come down. Their specific skill set is likely to rise, but their range of skills, because they're now only focusing on one task, is likely to drop. But their productivity, as they focus on one task and become better at that particular task, should allow their productivity to actually rise. Okay, and last question, question 1. Which statement is the most valid reason for government intervention in a free market economy? Consumers are well informed, making it difficult for producers to make profits. That is not a valid reason for government intervention. If consumers are well informed, that's a good thing. We don't want to intervene in that because they're making rational and well informed decisions. Health and education are not available in sufficient quantities. Yes. Remember, health and education are merit goods, so they generate external benefits, and therefore governments will intervene to try and address the underconsumption and underproduction of those particular goods. Now C, producers are motivated only by profit. That is not a valid reason for government intervention. You might be thinking that, oh, I can choose that option because I know that that's a reason they don't produce public goods. But they don't tell us that in the question, so we can't assume that. Producers are only motivated by profit is not a reason for us to intervene. It is a reason for us to produce public goods. But that's not what we're told, right? We're only told it's government intervention. So it could be a variety of forms of government intervention, not just necessarily the provision of public goods. And finally, many competitive firms and not enough sole suppliers. That is not a reason for us to intervene in a free market economy. Okay, the market mechanism should sort that out. Especially more competitive firms means lower prices for consumers anyway, so it brings benefits that would mean we would not want to intervene in the first place. Okay, and that is May-June 2020 question paper 12 done.